There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a military base when something unexpected is about to happen. Not the silence of nothing going on. The silence of everything holding its breath. That morning, the air at the Naval Training Compound in Coronado, California sat heavy and salt-thick, the kind of morning where the Pacific looks more gray than blue and the seagulls don't bother flying far from the shore. 282 Navy SEALs were seated in the outdoor amphitheater, bleachers arranged in a horseshoe around a long rectangular mat. They had been told to show up. Nobody told them why. That was normal. In that world, you showed up, and you found out what was happening when it happened. Her name was Marina Vasiliev. She was 31 years old. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 132 pounds. And she had the kind of posture that made people think she was taller than she was. The kind of posture that came not from confidence lessons or yoga classes, but from 23 years of training that had reorganized her spine from the inside. She had been born in Novosibirsk, a Siberian city where winter is not a season, but a personality, where children learn to be hard before they learn to be soft, and where her father had started wrapping her small hands in cloth and teaching her the basics of combat when she was 8 years old because he believed, with the conviction of a man who had seen real violence, that the world had no mercy for the unprepared. She had trained in Sambo, which is not a martial art that gets a lot of attention in American gyms or action movies. It is Russian. It is brutal. It combines judo's throwing mechanics with wrestling's ground control and something else that has no clean translation, a philosophy of ending things completely, not winning on points, not impressing judges, but removing the opponent's ability to continue. She had also trained in judo, in wrestling, in Brazilian jiu-jitsu during a 3-year stretch she spent in Sao Paulo, and in Krav Maga during a year in Tel Aviv. She was not a hobbyist. She was not a fitness competitor with a highlight reel. She was a person who had spent the majority of her waking life in gyms, on mats, in competition halls, absorbing and cataloging every way a human body could be manipulated against itself. She had competed internationally for 12 years. She had won, repeatedly, in ways that were not always comfortable to watch. But none of that was why she was standing on this mat today, in front of 282 of the most physically capable men the United States military had ever produced. She was here because of something that had happened 3 weeks earlier at a joint tactical training session in Virginia. She had been brought in as a consultant, a civilian instructor, to demonstrate submission grappling techniques for a mixed group of special operations personnel. It was supposed to be a demonstration. Clean, professional, educational. She would show the technique. The attendees would watch. Everybody would go home having learned something. What actually happened was that 2 instructors on staff, both men, both with substantial credentials and substantial egos, had decided before she arrived that they were not interested in being taught by a woman who was not in the military and had never been in the military. They made this opinion known to each other loudly, and to the room less loudly but still loudly enough. When she began the demonstration, they interrupted. When she corrected a grip, one of them laughed. When she asked for a volunteer partner to demonstrate a leg lock sequence, the same man stood up, rolled his neck, cracked his knuckles with theatrical boredom, and stepped onto the mat with the energy of someone who had already decided the outcome. His name was Lieutenant Commander Dale Hutchins. He was 6 feet 2 inches, 220 pounds, and he had been doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu for 9 years. He had tapped out hundreds of training partners. He had a blue belt. He stepped onto that mat the way a man steps into a room he owns. She broke his leg in 47 seconds. Not metaphorically, not a figure of speech. A clean, controlled application of a heel hook that she had warned him was coming, that she had given him 3 separate opportunities to tap out of before she applied final pressure, and which he had refused each time because he was performing for the room, and the room was watching, and he had decided that tapping for a woman in front of his peers was a price he was not willing to pay. The price he paid instead was a torn ACL, a partially torn LCL, and a fracture of the fibula just above the ankle. He did not tap out. He passed out. The second instructor, whose name was Senior Chief Raymond Poole, had made the mistake of saying, loudly, while Hutchins was still on the ground, that it was a lucky shot. He used a word before lucky that is not worth repeating. He said she had gotten lucky, and that if they went again she would not pull the same trick twice. She looked at him for a long moment. The room was very quiet. She said, simply, okay. Raymond Poole was 235 pounds, and had been doing combatives training for 11 years. He had, according to his own frequent testimony, never lost a fight. She broke his leg in 1 minute and 12 seconds. Same heel hook, different leg, same 3 opportunities to tap. He made it through 2 of them before the sound his knee made the decision for him. The room she left behind in Virginia was silent in the way rooms are silent after something has shifted that cannot unshift. What happened next was not entirely her doing. Videos circulated. Videos always circulate. Someone's phone had been out, had caught the second encounter in full, and within 72 hours it had moved through military circles in the specific accelerated way that things move when they are simultaneously embarrassing and undeniable. The top brass at the Naval Special Warfare Command saw it. They watched it multiple times, according to people who were present during those watchings. Then, they made a phone call. The phone call was to her. The question they asked her was whether she would be willing to come to Coronado and conduct a full training day with active SEAL teams. A real one, not a demonstration, not a showcase. A day of actual instruction, with her actually teaching and them actually learning. She said yes. She always said yes to that question. It was the only question she ever found interesting. What she did not know, or perhaps what she suspected but did not say aloud, was that the invitation had an additional layer to it that nobody had explicitly stated. The men who would be in those bleachers were not just being given a training opportunity. They were being given something to reckon with. The 2 men in Virginia had been wrong in a specific and public way, and the institution that contained them needed everyone to understand, without anyone having to say it outright in a memo, exactly how wrong they had been. She arrived the evening before. She was given a room in the visitors' quarters. She did not sleep much, not from nerves, but from habit. She had never slept much before competition days. Her brain did not know how to be quiet when something was coming. She lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and ran through sequences in her mind. Not anxious sequences, just movements. The way a musician plays scales before a performance, keeping the fingers awake. In the morning she dressed plainly. Dark compression pants. A gray training shirt. No logos. No statement. Her hair pulled back with the efficiency of a person who has pulled their hair back before every important moment of their adult life and stopped thinking about it years ago. She ate breakfast alone in the small dining facility. Eggs, rice, coffee black. She was aware of being looked at. She was always aware of being looked at in spaces like this, spaces designed around a particular type of body and a particular type of person, spaces where she was neither. She had stopped letting that awareness cost her anything significant around the time she was 22. It still registered. It just didn't land. By 8 in the morning the bleachers were full. She walked to the center of the mat and stood there and looked at 282 faces looking back at her. There were no expressions she could not read. She had stood in front of crowds her entire life. She knew the skeptical face. She knew the politely neutral face that was covering the skeptical face. She knew the genuinely curious face. She knew the face of the man who had already made up his mind and was here to have his mind confirmed. She saw all of them. She did not introduce herself with her credentials. She did not make a speech. She did not tell them what they were going to learn or why it mattered. She reached down to the equipment bag she had set beside the mat, pulled out a mouthguard, put it in, and said through it, clearly enough to be understood, "I need a volunteer." The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. 282 men who had volunteered for one of the most demanding military programs on Earth, who had run through surf and sand until their bodies forgot what warmth felt like, who had been taught that hesitation was a luxury they could not afford. Every single one of them hesitated. That hesitation was the first lesson of the day. She let it breathe for a full 7 seconds before she pointed at a man in the third row and said, without judgment, without amusement, without anything except mild attention, "You, come down." He came down. His name was Petty Officer First Class Derek Inouye. He was 6'1", 215 pounds, with a neck that suggested his body had opinions about physics. He had been doing judo and wrestling since high school. He stepped onto the mat and looked at her, and she could see him doing the math that people always do when they step onto a mat with her for the first time. The math that feels so certain before anything has happened. She shook his hand. She said, "I'm going to show the group a single technique. I'm going to apply it to you. I'm going to give you every opportunity to escape it. I want you to try. Genuinely try." He nodded. He was taking her seriously. She respected that immediately. She set her grip. What happened in the next 40 seconds rearranged something in the bleachers that would not go back to how it had been. He was strong. He was technical. He knew what she was doing as she was doing it, which was more than most people could say, and he fought it with real intelligence and real power. She adjusted. Twice she had to adjust, which she noted inwardly because it did not happen often. She found the angle. She found the moment. She did not break his leg. She applied just enough pressure that his body told him the next half-inch would cost him something he could not afford to lose. And he tapped. He tapped clean and fast and without drama, the tap of a man who knew what had just happened and had no interest in pretending otherwise. He stood up. He looked at her. He said again. She said, yes. Behind them, in the bleachers, 281 men leaned forward. The day had not yet truly begun. It was 8:17 in the morning. The sun had just cleared the buildings to the east and was laying flat gold light across the mat and across her face and across the faces of the men watching, and nobody in those bleachers was thinking about anywhere they would rather be. The real reckoning was still coming. But it started here, in that lean, in that collective forward shift of 281 bodies moving towards something they had not expected to want to see. She reset her grip. She began. By 10 in the morning, 6 men had tapped. All of them voluntary. All of them on the mat because they had stepped up, not because they had been called. Something had shifted in the dynamic of those bleachers somewhere between Derek and Noah's clean tap and the third volunteer, a compact Hawaiian man named Torres who had gone 3 full minutes before the angle found him. And in that shift, the crowd had stopped being an audience and started being something harder to name. They were watching the way people watch something they're trying to understand, not just see. Marina had been a competition fighter for 12 years. She had felt crowds before. She knew the crowd that wanted her to fail could feel it as a specific pressure against the skin. She knew the crowd that wanted a spectacle and would cheer for anything that moved fast enough. She knew the crowd that didn't care about her at all and was really just watching technique, watching the geometry of bodies and force. What she was feeling from these bleachers now was something else. It was a crowd in the process of revising an opinion. That was a particular feeling. Rare. She had only felt it a handful of times in her career. It felt like a room changing temperature. She was not teaching to impress them. That was not a goal she had carried onto the mat. She was teaching because teaching was the only way she knew to fully articulate what she knew, and what she knew was substantial and exact and had taken 2 decades to accumulate. She taught the way she fought, with patience, with precision, with a complete absence of performance. She broke the session into segments. The first had been demonstration, which was now behind them. The second was instruction. She stood at the edge of the mat and talked about weight distribution in a way that most of the men had never heard it explained, not because nobody had tried to explain it to them before, but because she explained it through her own body rather than through language alone. She moved through the position as she named it, and when she named it, she did not use jargon as a shield. She used it as a door, explaining each term as if the term were interesting because it was, because every term in grappling was a compressed description of something that had taken someone, somewhere, a long time to figure out. A hand went up in the bleachers. 3rd row. A lean, angular man with the particular stillness of someone who had been listening very carefully. His name, she would learn later, was Chief Warrant Officer Elias Holt. He asked, when you applied the heel hook on Hutchins in Virginia, was that the first technique you were going for, or did you shift mid-sequence? The bleachers went quiet in a specific way. The question named what everybody in those bleachers had been thinking about. The video. Virginia. The 2 legs. Nobody had mentioned it yet today. It had been sitting in the room all morning like furniture nobody was acknowledging. She looked at him. She said, second choice. He defended the inside position better than I expected. He was technically better than he appeared. The room absorbed that. She had paid a compliment to a man who had been publicly embarrassing to the institution she was currently standing in. Nobody missed it. Holt nodded slowly. What was your read on him before you started? That he would defend his ego more aggressively than his leg. A sound went through the bleachers. Not laughter exactly. Something shorter and more complicated. Recognition, maybe. She let it sit for 2 seconds, and then she moved on. The 3rd segment was partner drilling. She paired them herself, which raised a few eyebrows, pairing by what she had observed during the demonstration phase, which meant she was pairing men she had been watching and assessing for 2 hours without any of them knowing they were being watched and assessed. The pairings were not random, and They were not by size. She paired a large man with a fast man. She paired a technical man with an instinctive one. She paired an OI with a smaller second-class petty officer named Kim who had the grip strength of a hydraulic press, and a ground game built on patience so extreme it bordered on predatory. They drilled. She moved through the pairs. She corrected. She adjusted. She said very little that was not directly related to the body position in front of her. At one point she crouched beside a pair who had gotten tangled in a scramble that had stopped making technical sense, and she put her hand on the elbow of the man on top, and moved it 3 inches to the left, and the entire position unlocked, and the man on the bottom tapped before anything had even been applied because he could feel what was coming, and he did not need to experience the completion of it to know it was over. The man on top, a young petty officer named Graves who looked barely old enough to shave, sat up and stared at his own elbow. He said, "How did you know?" She said, "Because the angle of your shoulder was telling me what your elbow was going to do before your elbow knew." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, very quietly, "That's insane." She said, "That's attention." The session went to midday and past it. Nobody brought up lunch. Nobody looked at their watch. She had been on her feet for 4.5 hours, which was nothing to her, but she was aware that she was also on, in the way performers are on, and being on for that long in front of a crowd that is this attentive has its own weight. She drank water when she thought to drink it. She ate nothing. At 12:47, a second hand went up. This one from the back row, a man she had barely been able to see all morning, seated at the top of the bleachers with a stillness that was different from Holt's stillness. Holt was still in the way of someone listening. This man was still in the way of someone deciding. He was older than most of the others. She had noticed him without focusing on him, the way you notice a sound without yet knowing what made it. He stood up when she acknowledged him. He was tall. He was not young. He had gray at his temples, and the particular flatness of expression that comes from having seen enough that most things no longer produce a reaction. She would find out later that his name was Master Chief Perry Wendell, 22 years in naval special warfare, 3 combat deployments, and a record in hand-to-hand combatives training that was considered something close to institutional legend within his community. He said, "Ma'am, with respect, I'd like to come down." The bleachers did not make a sound. She looked at him. He was not Hutchins. She could see that immediately. He was not coming down to prove a point or perform for the room. He was coming down because he was a person who had spent 22 years taking the measure of things, and he had spent the morning deciding that the only way to take an accurate measure of this particular thing was to be in contact with it. She said, "Come down." He descended from the back row without hurry. He was 6 feet even, maybe 210 pounds, and he moved onto the mat with the economy of someone for whom movement had long ago stopped being a form of expression and become purely functional. He faced her. He bowed. She bowed. They gripped. What happened for the next 4 minutes and 9 seconds was something that the men in those bleachers would describe, individually, over the months and years that followed, in at least a dozen different ways depending on who they were talking to and what they were trying to say. Some would describe it as the best technical grappling exchange they had ever seen live. Some would say it was humbling to watch. One would write, in a training memoir published 3 years later, that it was the moment he understood that fighting intelligence was not the same thing as fighting ability, and not the same thing as fighting experience, and that the rarest people were the ones who had all three simultaneously and had organized them into something coherent. Wendell was extraordinary. That was clear. He defended positions she expected to be finished by the first minute. He found escapes she had to genuinely work against. He was not reactive. He was predictive, reading sequences a step ahead, and prepositioning to compromise her options before she arrived at them. He was the best of the 6 men who had come to the mat that day, by a margin that was significant. She finished him at 4 minutes and 9 seconds with a shoulder lock applied from a position that he had, by any reasonable assessment, been safer than the position before it. The transition that led to the finish was one she had drilled approximately 20,000 times over 23 years. It was hers. She had not learned it from a teacher or a video or a competition. She had built it herself in a gym in St. Petersburg when she was 19, after losing a match she should have won and spending 3 weeks reverse engineering why. He tapped. He held the tap for a full breath before he released it, which she noticed. He sat up. She released the position and sat back. They looked at each other on the mat with the mat between them and around them, and the silence of 281 men above them. He said, "Where did that come from?" She said, "A loss." He absorbed that. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man filing something away. He said, "What was the loss?" She said, "Does it matter?" He looked at her for another moment. He said, "No, I suppose it doesn't." He stood. He offered his hand. She shook it. He walked back up the bleachers without looking at the crowd around him, which was how she knew he was a man who had never cared much about the crowd. She turned back to the center of the mat. The afternoon session had not yet begun. She had more to teach. She had, honestly, more to teach than a single day could hold, more than most training programs allowed for in a semester. 23 years of accumulated, organized, pressure-tested knowledge. She was aware, as she reset for the afternoon, that what was happening in those bleachers was not just about combat technique. She had been around enough men in enough training environments to understand the specific thing that happens when a group revises a collective assumption. It does not happen easily. It requires something concrete and undeniable, something that cannot be argued around or attributed to luck or circumstance. It requires the kind of evidence that sits in the body, not in the brain. The brain argues. The body knows. 6 men had tapped to her today. One of them had been the most decorated combatives practitioner in the room. All of them had tried. She had not been trying to make a point. She had been trying to teach. But the teaching and the point had become the same thing, which was not something she had engineered. It was something that had simply happened when reality was allowed to be what it was. She picked up her water bottle. She drank. She set it down. She said, "Afternoon session. Different entries. Different finishing sequences. Everybody on the mat." 282 men stood up. Not all at once. Not with drama. They stood the way people stand when they have decided something, one at a time, in different moments, finding their feet beneath them and coming to a conclusion that had been building all morning and had simply, now, arrived. She watched them come down. She had one more thing to show them. The most important thing. The thing that had taken her the longest to learn. Not the technique, but the principle underneath the technique. The thing that made everything else possible. She had saved it for last deliberately, the way a good teacher saves the frame for after the painting. So the painting has a chance to be seen before the student knows what holds it together. The afternoon would go 2 more hours. Those 2 hours would be the part that nobody who was present would fully be able to explain to someone who wasn't. Some things do not translate into language well. This was going to be one of them. She knew that going in. She taught it anyway. The last thing she taught them was patience. Not patience as a virtue. Not the kind that gets cross-stitched onto decorative pillows. The specific, weaponized patience of someone who has learned that the opponent always reveals the opening. Always, without exception, if you are quiet enough inside to notice it when it arrives. She called it, in her own internal vocabulary, the still place. She had never used that phrase publicly before. She used it now because she was tired in the way that makes honesty cheap, and because these men had earned it. They had been on their feet all day. They had been on the mat. They had tapped and stood back up and tapped again and stood back up again without complaint, which was the only currency she recognized as meaningful. She stood at the edge of the mat and, she said, without preamble, "Every fighter has a speed they think at. Most training accelerates that speed. I want to tell you about slowing it down." The bleachers were close to silent. The afternoon light had gone amber and horizontal, coming in at a low angle through the gaps in the fencing around the compound, cutting long shadows across the mat. 282 men were in various states of physical exhaustion. Joints had been torqued. Muscles had been worked at angles they weren't accustomed to. Anoa'i had a red compression welt across his left collarbone from a position they had drilled in the second hour of the afternoon. Graves was sitting with both hands around his own right knee, not nursing an injury, just thinking through it. Feeling the architecture of the joint, he now understood better than he had that morning. Master Chief Wendell was in his same seat at the top of the bleachers. He had not moved from that seat since he came back up from the mat after their exchange. He had been watching everything with the same quality of attention he had brought to the mat itself. She had been aware of him up there. Not uncomfortably. The way you are aware of weather. She talked for 20 minutes about the still place and about what it took to find it under pressure, which was different from finding it in a quiet gym when nobody was watching. Finding it under pressure required first that you had sat in enough pressure to know what it actually felt like, to know the difference between the adrenaline spike of the early moment and the settled attention of someone who had been in the moment long enough to find their floor. Most people, she said, train the first state. Very few train the transition to the second. That transition is where fights are actually decided, not in the explosion of the opening. In the 6 seconds after the explosion, when the person whose brain recovers fastest finds their ground and sees what is actually in front of them. She had never read this in a book. She had found it by losing and losing and losing again in controlled environments over 2 decades until she had accumulated enough data points to recognize the pattern. Losing had been her primary teacher. She said this plainly, without self-deprecation and without drama, as a fact. The men in the bleachers received it as a fact. Holt, from the third row, said, "How do you train the transition?" She said, "You put yourself in bad positions on purpose, and you practice finding your floor from there. Not escaping, not countering, just finding your floor. You do that enough times, under enough different conditions, and eventually the floor is always there." She paused. She said, "Most people avoid the bad position. They drill the good one. That's why most people plateau." The compound was quiet except for the Pacific, which was not quiet but was consistent, which amounted to the same thing. She moved to the last physical demonstration of the day. She called up 3 men simultaneously, which she had not done before. 2 large men from the morning session and Kim, the patient one who had drilled with an OI. She told the 2 large men to hold her arms. Not a simulation. Actually hold. She told Kim to stand in front and told him his job was to apply a choke from the front the moment she stopped moving. She stopped moving immediately. What happened in the next 11 seconds was hard to track from the bleachers. It was fast in the specific way that things that have been drilled 20,000 times are fast, not explosive speed, but efficiency speed, the speed of zero wasted motion. One large man went to the mat. The other large man's grip broke in a direction his wrist had not anticipated. Kim reached for the choke and found that the person he was reaching for was no longer where she had been. And by the time he processed this, she was behind him with his back in a position that would have ended the exchange in 3 more seconds if she had chosen to end it. She did not end it. She released. She stepped back. She said, "The still place is what let me feel where all 3 of you were going before you went there. Not strength. Not speed. Attention." Kim stood up and looked at his own hands. He turned around and looked at her. He said, "Were you scared?" The question was not what anyone expected. The bleachers went a little more quiet. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Yes." "Of what?" She said, "Getting it wrong in front of you." That answer moved through the bleachers in a way that was distinct from anything else that had moved through them that day. It was not admiration exactly. Admiration was what they'd been shifting toward all morning. This was something more specific. It was the recognition of someone who had just shown them something real that cost them something to show. The fear was not of the 3 men. The fear was of the responsibility of teaching correctly in front of people who deserved to be taught correctly. That distinction mattered to everyone in those bleachers in a way that arrived faster than it could be articulated. The session ended at 4:22 in the afternoon. She did not end it with a speech. She did not summarize what they had learned. She did not tell them to carry this into the field or to think of her when they drilled. She said, "That's the day. Thank you for your attention." She picked up her bag. She pulled out her phone. She read something on it for a moment with a small furrow between her eyebrows that had nothing to do with anyone in the bleachers. She put the phone away. She was about to walk toward the exit gate when Wendell came down from the bleachers. He came down the same way he had come down the first time. Without hurry. Without performance. He reached the bottom and walked across the mat and stopped a few feet from her. He was holding his training cap in both hands in a way that she recognized instinctively as the body language of a man who wanted to say something with care. He said, "I've been in this community 22 years. I've trained with a lot of people. I want to say something, and I want to say it clearly because I think it's been a long time coming for some of the people in those bleachers, maybe including me." She waited. He said, "What happened in Virginia 3 weeks ago with Hutchins and Poole? That was not a surprise to me, what they did. I've seen that behavior my whole career. I've seen it cost us training opportunities, cost us relationships with people who had things to offer, cost some of those people dignity they were owed. I didn't always stop it when I should have. I want to be straight with you about that." She looked at him. He said, "Today mattered. Not because of what you know, though what you know is significant. It mattered because you were here. That you came back after Virginia, and you came here, and you did the work. That is not a small thing." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "The 2 in Virginia. Do you know how they're doing?" Wendell's expression shifted slightly. He said, Hutchins will recover. He's in PT. Poole has surgery scheduled next month. He paused. They've been told, at the command level, that what happened in Virginia was a result of their behavior and not your technique. She said, was that difficult to communicate? He said, not as difficult as it should have been. She nodded slowly. She said, for what it's worth. The heel hook I used on both of them. There were 3 moments in each exchange where they could have exited cleanly. It is not a surprise technique. There is no deception in it. It is a position that is communicated by the body before it is applied. They felt it coming. They chose not to respond to it. She said this without heat. As a technical assessment, that choice was not about me. That choice was about what they were willing to admit in front of other people. And that is the only thing I'd want them to understand, if they're interested in understanding anything. Wendell looked at her for a long moment. He said, I'll pass that along. She picked up her bag again. She started toward the gate. Behind her, from the bleachers, where 282 men had been gathering their gear and talking in the low, tired way that men talk after a long physical day, something happened that she heard without turning around. Applause. Not the organized simultaneous applause of a performance ending. The kind that starts from one person and then finds 2 more and then cascades. The kind that surprises the people doing it because it arrives before they've consciously decided to do it. It was loud. It went on longer than applause at the end of a training day had any technical reason to go on. She did not turn around. She walked through the gate and across the parking area to her rental car. She set her bag in the back seat. She sat in the driver's seat. She sat there for a moment with her hands in her lap, and the ocean somewhere behind the buildings, and the sound of the applause still fading in the air. She was not crying. That is not what this moment was. She was doing what she always did at the end of a hard day. She was running the film. Every moment she had gotten right, and every moment she had gotten wrong, and the transitions between them. The 4 minutes and 9 seconds with Wendell, and the 2 adjustments she'd had to make in the 3rd minute, and what those adjustments told her about a gap in her own defense she had been aware of for 2 years but had not yet solved. The 3-man demonstration and the clean exit and the half-second of genuine fear she'd felt in the moment before she moved, when 3 bodies were in contact with hers, and the still place had taken a full 2 seconds to arrive, which was longer than it should have taken. She filed it all. She started the car. She drove toward the bridge, toward the mainland, toward the airport, and the early morning flight, and the next country, the next mat, the next group of people who had something to teach her inside their resistance. This was her life, and she had chosen it every day for 23 years, and she would choose it again tomorrow. In Virginia, in a rehabilitation clinic, Dale Hutchins was in his 3rd week of physical therapy. His therapist was a woman. He had, by the account of his own physical therapist, stopped making the jokes about it that he had been making during the 1st week. He did his exercises. He was going to recover fully. He was not sure yet what he was going to do with what had happened to him, what sense to make of it, what it meant about him or about the world. He was still in that process. He had, without telling anyone, watched the phone video of his own encounter on the mat 7 times. He was not sure why he kept watching it. Each time he watched it, he saw the 3 moments she had described to Wendell, the 3 exit points he had not taken, and each time he watched it, he saw himself refusing them with the specific energy of a man protecting something that turned out not to be worth protecting. He was still in that process too. Across the bay in Coronado, the bleachers had emptied. The mat lay flat and clean under the late afternoon sun, which was doing what Pacific sun does in the late afternoon, burning orange and enormous toward the water, making the air look edible. Petty Officer First Class Derek Inouye was the last one off the mat. He stood at the edge of it for a moment before he left, looking at the empty center where she had stood that morning, and said she needed a volunteer, and waited 7 full seconds in the silence of 282 men, discovering a new kind of hesitation. He thought about tapping, about the clean, fast certainty of it, about how it had not felt like defeat. He thought about what she had said when he asked to go again, and she had said yes without making it mean anything more than yes. He put his cap on and walked off the mat. The sun hit the water. The day was done. She was already on the highway, already in the next thing, already listening to whatever her body was telling her about what still needed work. The mat behind her. The next mat ahead. 23 years behind. Whatever came next, ahead. She turned on the radio. She drove. The Pacific shrank in her rearview mirror. She did not look at it. She was already somewhere else in her mind, somewhere on a mat, somewhere mid-sequence, somewhere in the still place where everything is quiet, and the next move announces itself, and there is nothing to do but receive it and respond. That was all it had ever been. That was enough.